All right, we are just about ready to begin for this evening. Geez, that's awfully bright. I'm going to have to dim some lights. All right, I wanted to keep as much light as possible because we're going to use the blackboard tonight. In ancient China, there was a man whose name was Kung Fu Si, and we know him as Confucius. And at one time, he was together doing the ancient rituals with other elders. And in the middle of doing the ancient rituals, Kung Fu Si said, "What are we doing?" And all of the other elders were upset, and Kung Fu Si said they didn't know that it is one of the features of the ancient rituals to question the ancient rituals. And that was what he was doing. He was staying with it. That's very wise. And we're going to begin this evening by doing a very little bit of that. It is, we've been doing this for just about 2 3/4 years, and we want to look back on what we did and understand that there is a purpose for doing things the way we did them. The first few sections were dedicated to looking at the life cycle, or the span of life, in segments, in halves, in thirds, in quarters, and we still have one segmentation to do, which will come at a later time. And the idea was that these things are not directly astrological. By looking at one's horoscope, you can get an idea indirectly of how the early part of life will be, or the middle part of life, or the later part of life. And we began that to get the idea that things change at different times in life. And this whole series of talks called AstroDynamics is about the astrology of change. What conditions produce change, and what we do with the changing astrological atmosphere. After that, we proceeded into the various systems of the astrology of time. What we did was look at methods that are commonly used for forecasting. And we began with transits. Transits are the positions of the planets as they are at the moment in the heavens. And transits in astrology are used to understand how their relationship with a natal chart, or how the individual is responding to what's in the air. Very often, the transits have a lot to do with the times. Like if there's war, people want to know if they're going to be drafted, or if they're going to be in jeopardy. So transiting astrology is an astrology that is very in the moment. And it's the most common form of astrodynamics that people know about. That's why we spoke about it first, which may not have been the best way of doing things. And we looked at transits, especially in the horoscope of the speaker, and how they related to conditions in his life as his life changed. And we saw that it was quite remarkable that transits in periods and at specific times did relate to things in his life. Then we looked at the horoscopes of presidents and tried to see if the transits at the time of their first inauguration were meaningful. And we were not too successful with that. We found some things, but it wasn't something that we could say that we could understand someone's presidency by looking at the transits at the time of the inauguration. Nor could we say that it was something that brought out latent qualities or brought out qualities that would otherwise have not been brought out. So we did get some modicum of understanding by looking at transits of inaugurations. All right, and then we looked at secondary progressions. And secondary progressions are based on the movement of the planets after birth. The common denominator of all of these predictive methods or forecasting methods is the degree. And the sun progresses 1 degree every day, so that if you want to know things that'll happen at age 30, you look at the position of the sun and the other planets, because the sun is the center of it all, 30 days after birth. And this is what you might say that the horoscope represents a fundamental archetype of the character, and that the progressions are a delineation of that character as it unfolds in time. One of the pictures that we used, or one of the images that we used, was throwing a stone in the water. And if we throw a stone in the water, waves in circles move out from the center of, from the central point where the stone hit the water. The only difference is that the waves that come out from the impact of a stone are always circular. But the waves that come out in progression from the time of birth take the same shape as the shape of the natal horoscope. And again, we looked at progressions, significant progressions in the chart of the speaker, and we found out that they were, again, very insightful. They provided a lot of ways to draw insight into the nature of his character. Whereas the transits indicate how one responds to conditions without in the external world, the progressions indicate what comes from within and flows out into the world. It's not a response to outward conditions. It is a response to an inward impulse that began its active manifestation at the moment of birth. We found out a lot of things about the nature of the speaker on the basis of progressions. And it was, again, extremely accurate to major events in his life. Then we did the same thing with presidents and their first inaugurations. We tried to see whether there was something that was an outpouring from the basic character of each of the presidents. We only use the modern presidents, the ones that I have lived under. We tried to see whether the presidency was something they always wanted, and whether it was a fulfillment of something very basic in their character. Again, we found in some cases that that was true, that in some cases there was indeed a fulfillment of a particular element of the character. But again, it was not something that we could say was, that we could always say that this was a high point in the life of the individuals from an astrological point of view. Very often you take somebody like Lyndon Johnson, had a lot of other experiences in life, very milestones where he accomplished things or had various different honors, and the presidency was not the ultimate for him. And then the next thing we did was we looked at a poor man's version of primary directions. And primary directions are different from the other methods of forecasting that we have looked at before. The transits depend on the planets out in the heavens and how they impinge on the Earth. The progressions depend on the movement of the Earth in its orbit around the Sun, or all of the planets, but relative to the Earth in its movement around the Sun, its orbital revolution. The primary directions depend on axial rotation, and they depend on the spin of the Earth. And you have to be very accurate in your time of birth in order to do any predicting with any kind of accuracy at all with primary directions. Now, we didn't want to go into that with a lot of mathematics, because chances are that almost all people who study astrology do not get into primary directions because it is extremely demanding mathematically. If we remember, we had my friend Rick gave us a talk on primary directions and related subjects. And it was highly technical. It was like a lot of information, or bits of a lot of information, to introduce ideas that came by very, very rapidly. If you go to my YouTube site, you can find that talk by Rick. You'll see his picture, which is a lot different looking than I am. And if you want a taste of technicality. So we did a poor man's version. What we did is we took tables of houses, and we took the sidereal time at birth, and we took sidereal times when the ascendant or the midheaven formed aspects with the planets in the natal horoscope. It gave us an approximation. It was not a precision activity, but again, within the bounds of reasonable interpretation of approximation. Again, in the horoscope of me, it was accurate. It pointed out things that we didn't see in the others, and in some cases what's the right word here? It corroborated what we had done earlier. So, and we found that all the way, that the transits corroborated with the progressions, and the primary directions worked with both. So that is where we left off. After looking at my chart with primary directions, we did the same thing with the presidents at the time of inauguration, but we were dealing with something, that we didn't have the level of accuracy to do very much, but nonetheless, we found, again, some indication of the functioning of primary directions and what it meant in their lives. Now that's as far as we have gone. And what we're doing at this moment is we are trying to look at what we're doing. What are we doing? As Kung Fu Si asked in his questioning of the activities of the elders. Now, if you look at this, we began with a vague understanding of a life in big sectors of life. And then we began to look more accurately, or we shrank the time, and we are we're trying to get closer and closer. See, the objective of what we're trying to do is look at a big period of time, and then within that period of time, what is more important, or what is the flavor of it, and then within that, we take smaller periods of time and look for the accuracy there. So if we had been true to doing this all the way through, we would have looked at progressions first. Because a progression, like a solar progression, and on average a progression by Venus and Mercury, secondary progression, a solar progression will last 3 years, a year and a half applying, and then there's culmination, and then a year and a half in separation. And that's using a reasonable orb of influence. Some astrologers use much larger orbs, and very few use smaller orbs. Now, within that 3.5-year period, if we look at a transit, some transits last for a long time, and some of them last for a short time. Like a transit of Saturn might last for a year. So if we see that there is that 3-year span of a progression, and within that 3-year period, one of those years coincides with a Saturn transit of the same planet or any other planet, that gives us a sub area of influence, that it gives it a slightly different flavor. So you might say that the progressions are more like the hour hand, and the transits are more like the minute hand. And now we want to get to sub-sectors. We're trying to zero in on exact times and get the flavor. And then where the talent of astrology comes in is blending these elements, the 3-year part and the 1-year part, and it might be 1 month, or it might even be just 1 day eventually that we look at. And so we're trying to understand the influence of astrology in time, and we're doing it by looking at increasingly smaller sections of time and the influences of those sections of time. So, that said, now we're going to begin to talk about something that is an introduction to what we're going to do for the next several months. Now, if you will note that when we have looked at transits, we looked only at the outer planets. Not even much at Mars, but Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are the planets that are most commonly used in transits. And when we looked at progressions, we looked at Sun, Venus, Mercury, and Mars, the inner planets, because they are the ones that move enough in the days after birth to count. When we looked at primary directions, we could look at any of the planets, because primary directions are based on a very different kind of, they're based on the rotation of the Earth rather than the planets moving through orbits around the sun. In all of these things, we haven't talked about the moon. Progressions of the moon last a month, if even that. Transits of the moon are often just a very few hours. It's because the moon moves much faster. So now that we're looking at smaller periods of time, we're looking, we've got the hour hand and the minute hand, now we want to get to the second hand. And that is mostly has to do with the moon. So what we're going to do now is we're going to begin talking about the moon, but the moon is, there's a lot to it. So what we're going to talk about is one of the most fundamental things in all of astrology, and that is the lunation cycle. That is from new moon to new moon. The lunation cycle is fundamental to all astrology. My natural father never studied astrology in his life, but he observed life. And he knew that in certain phases of the moon, he could collect bills better than at other times. He had a small plumbing business in a small town, and people would order plumbing work done, and often they didn't want to pay, or they couldn't always pay. And he found out that he was more successful at certain phases of the moon to he'd go visit people at their house and he'd converse with them. He loved to converse with people. And he would converse with them, and then he would bring up the matter of the bill, and they'd give him a check or something like that, and that's the way it worked. The lunation cycle has been influential and understood by societies that did not have any astrology other than naked eye observation. Probably the best example that we're all familiar with is the Native Americans. Native Americans had names for each of the new moons. We had this morning here at 7 o'clock in the morning, I think, here in Madison, Wisconsin, we had a new moon that was in Gemini. And to the Native Americans, this would have been the new moon of the ripening of the strawberries. And so the new moons and the full moons each had their own name for what happened with them. So this is something that has been studied. It was studied very carefully, like the Babylonians would watch the first sighting of the moon after a new moon, what it looked like, and whether the fringes of it were ragged because of the craters on the moon, didn't make a clear arc. They would they would find meanings in all of those things. They used astrology as divination more than as a means to understand the psychological makeup of someone or to understand what's going on in the political arena or whatever. So what we're going to do then is we're going to follow the lunation cycle, and if you get used to this and understand this, this is the basis for understanding all cycles. The sun and the moon are the most obvious forces in the heavens. The moon rules the tides and much more, and the sun relates to the seasons. Our relationship to the sun relates to the seasons. And so these are the two most important factors in our lives. So it's not surprising that the cycle of the sun and the moon are as important as they are. In fact, there's more than one cycle between the sun and the moon. I had something like 20-some unique cycles between sun and moon, and I had an astronomy book once that had them all listed, and somehow I let that get away on me. And there's a lot of things that have happened like that in life where things have gotten away from me. So we're going to be talking then about the lunation cycle. Now I have a circle here on the board, and that circle describes the entire cycle. And what we're going to do is we're going to fill it in. And we'll say that at this point, at the bottom of the circle, is a new moon. I just got my hand out of a cast today, so my writing is not very good. The conjunction is the aspects aspect. Whether you study India astrology or whether you study astrology in the United States, the aspects aspect is the conjunction. And for example, the aspects in India are called yogas, meaning positions and meaning shapes and things like that. In fact, if you look through my website at fellowshipofthespirit.com, in the astrology section, there are several series of talks on aspects, and it's probably some of the best work that I've ever done in presenting astrological things. So all cycles begin with the conjunction. All cycles end with the conjunction. Because if you have a cycle, there is no beginning and end. It goes around and around again and again. There's forward movement. So the conjunction is where things come together. And the moon represents the forces of manifestation, of a kind of formulating things or bringing form to things. The best example of that is the influence of the moon in the womb. When a woman is carrying a child, the different stages of that relate to the moon. The moon, the matrix or the womb itself, is ruled by the moon. Okay, so the moon is the pacemaker, and it carries out or it solidifies things. For the sun, for example, is the force of will. It is the force, it is a dynamic power source. And the moon takes that power and condenses it and brings it into material manifestation. If everything were completely solar, everything would burn up, and only beings that could live in an etheric state could manifest. If there were only moon, everything would turn to stone, and there would be no life, there would be no changing manifestation. And as it is, mystical astrologers claim that the relationship of the sun and moon is such that the balance is enough for us to be able to form bodies that manifest on the surface of the earth. Beings in the spiritual worlds are present on all of the planets, but only on Earth are we manifest in the physical sense, and that is because there is that perfect balance between the consolidating forces and the energetic forces. So that balance is extremely important. And if you look in the heavens, this is why we have eclipses. Depending on how far the Earth is from the moon and sun, the moon and the Earth are relatively the same size. They each occupy approximately 1/2 of a degree of space. And so that is a physical representation of a kind of balance that takes place spiritually as far as the influences of the sun and the moon are concerned. All right, so what happens is the sun and the moon conjoin, and the moon, now both are moving, but for the sake of studying the cycle, we're going to say that the sun stands still and that the moon moves forward. And it moves forward until there is a quarter moon, which is 90 degrees. And in this period, during the slower moving planet in a cycle, in this case the moon, rules the entire first half. So the first quarter, or the whole first half of this cycle, is ruled by the sun. It dominates. It gives the energy for the sun, for the moon to build with. And it controls how much energy it allows or how much it gives out. And at first, within the first 24 hours, you usually can't even see the moon. It's just like a little sliver at all. But by the time we get to the first quarter, the moon is half lit. Now, when you have a new moon, the sun and the moon are together, and that's a completely dark night. The sun rises and the moon rise at the same time, and they set at the same time, and there is nothing to light the heavens at that time. But at the first quarter, when the sun rises, the moon rises at sunset. The moon is at midheaven at sunset. I didn't say that very carefully. So in first quarter, the moon is 90 degrees ahead of the sun. And that turns out to be that when the sun is setting, the moon is at the midheaven. And then we see the moon for the rest of the night. In this, the sun is giving to the moon. It's giving the creative energy. But we can't be sexist about this, because we can look at this another way, and we can say that the moon is drawing out the energy from the sun, and the sun gives it out as it is drawn by the moon, because the moon represents the drawing powers. It represents the ability to take things in. Lunar herbs, for example, you use for drawing poisons out of a wound or something of that nature. So we said the first half of the cycle is the sun is giving to the moon, therefore the sun rules the first quarter in terms of giving and receiving. But the moon is also closer to the sun, and that propinquity gives the sun greater influence. So we can say that the first quarter is sun, sun. After the first quarter, the moon becomes gibbous until it comes to a full moon. It keeps getting bigger and bigger, so that if you read somewhere in literature it says Cynthia is pregnant, Cynthia is one of the names of the moon. It's talking about the fact that that is giving you a time. It's telling you that my phone is ringing and I forgot to shut it off, but I'll just let it go. So it's growing. It's called gibbous in this. At full moon, the moon is completely full. And this means that the consolidation of the energies from the sun have gone as far as they can go. Now we're talking about a cycle during which everything that is accomplished by humans is accomplished. So we're saying that if something is started with a new moon, it begins to take shape at the first quarter, and it has gone as far as it can go at the full moon. So usually if we want to work in harmony with the cosmos, we want to start things when the moon is new. Probably the worst time to start something is at a full moon, and there's one other place in the cycle that's very bad also for starting things. So the quality is that at the full moon, things are physically manifest. They have carried as far as they can go. But until the full moon, the sun still is giving. So if we take the second quarter of the moon, it's still ruled by the sun, but now things are closer to the moon. So the second quarter is sun, moon. And if you want to accomplish something, like what is started here has its most perfect accomplishment when the sun becomes trine to the moon in the second quarter. That is the most important time for perfection in the solar of the solar manifestation, or of what you're trying to accomplish in a cycle. At the full moon, everything is reflected back, and you can see the consequence of what you have done in its highest state. It is when the cycle is most ripe, and after things are ripe, they begin to go bad. They begin to rot. They begin to disintegrate. And after something has reached its fullness, that's the epitome. But it's the epitome that is as far as things can go. Now, obviously, there are things that are best done under a full moon. Now we know that the moon is not generating light itself, only the sun generates light, and Jupiter, a very little bit of light is generated by Jupiter, but or a little bit of energy is generated by Jupiter. I don't know whether it's light or not, but the moon is reflecting light. So at full moon, if you want to reflect on your life and you want to look at the images that you have put into the ethers and see, so you can see the consequences of what you have done. How does William Blake say it in Tiger, Tiger? Did was he pleased to see his creation? And memory work and reflective work are very important at the full moon. All right. Then this is a major change. Each of the quarters represents a major change. The change at the first quarter is when the moon is manifest enough so that it has secondary influence to the sun and it isn't all just solar. At the full moon is an even bigger or more important change, and that is when the moon begins to give to the sun. It disintegrates, and as it disintegrates, it gives things back to the sun. This is important. So the work of the first half of the cycle is different than the work of the second half of the lunation cycle. And the first half is primarily ruled by the sun, and the second half is primarily ruled by the moon. Now, there are words that are nice for the different things. I used to use the word destruction because the moon is destroyed in the second half of the cycle. It starts out bold and beautiful and full, and then it is destroyed and it shrinks, and its influence seems to be winnowing. But a better word, but still not a perfect word, is deconstruction. Deconstruction is when you take things apart and you see the elements that made up something. It was from that French philosopher. What was his name? Not good at remembering names anymore in life. Derrida. Derrida had developed the whole idea of deconstruction. And so what happens in the second half, in the lunar half of the lunation cycle, is a deconstruction versus the construction that takes place in the first half. Now, at different places, like for example, when the moon comes to sextile, that indicates a first, how would you say, beginner's luck. It represents when you have enough facility to do something and you're capable of carrying something out. That's what the first sextile is like. See, the new moon is sort of like if you put a seed in the ground, the shoot comes out, and unless you're experienced, you don't know what the shoot is. It could be a weed, or it could be a desired garden plant, or it could be a self-planted garden plant, and you don't know. And so things are in a very infantile state. They have not developed into a capacity. But at the first sextile, there is that beginner's luck. And as we said earlier, when there is the first trine, that's perfection. That's when you have as good of understanding as you're going to have and are as much in control of bringing things out as can be. At the quarters, things are metastable. That, when you're going from completely solar influence to solar lunar influence, sort of like when there's a relay race, when you're passing the baton, it's a trepidatious time when things are not all held together. So things that the moon starts giving its energies back to the sun. And when you come to the second trine, it's sort of when you've had the manifestation of something and you're taking it apart and you can understand the principles not in theory and not as an outward obvious manifestation, but you can understand them, the principles that are involved, because the principles are now manifest because the forces have become consolidated into a reality, and when you break that reality down, you can see how those principles were made up the situation that there was. So the moon is giving at the moon takes over the giving, and so you can say that the third quarter of the moon is ruled by the moon because the moon is the giver, and things are still closer to the moon, things are still more in a reflective nature. So the third quarter is moon in the same way that the first quarter is sun. And then things become, at full moon, the moon rises when the sun sets. At third quarter, the moon rises at midnight. And only between midnight and dawn can you see the moon. You have to be a very nocturnal person to see it in the fourth quarter. So, but all right. So this is an evening moon. This is a morning moon, working toward a midday. This is an evening moon. So the third quarter of the moon is when the part of the control in terms of propinquity or in terms of more immediate attraction, the moon gives over to the sun in the secondary effect. The moon is still in charge because it's giving. And the one who gives says, it's like the bursar. It has the purse and it allows this much to be given out and no more. And the person who controls the purse strings controls the whole relationship. So as things, you might say, when you reach the third quarter, the moon is not only giving to the sun, but it is being attracted back to the sun. In the same way that in the second quarter, the moon was being attracted to the moon as the secondary, the moon is being attracted by the sun in the last quarter. So the last quarter is when the influence, when most of the experience of the first half is being given up. Most of it is over half of it is given up by the third quarter of the moon. And it's giving more and more. And you might say that the moon is desperate for more new experience, so that it becomes increasingly solar as it comes to the end of the cycle. In fact, the last days, it's sort of a desperate moon in the last days. And things that are done on the last day or two of the lunation cycle, the whole cycle takes 28 days. And in the, it happens actually it takes 29 days, but that's because the sun has moved forward. The moon goes around the heaven in 28 days, but in those 28 days, the sun has moved forward enough so that it takes a longer amount of time to come back to the sun. So like you can say that the sidereal cycle of the moon is 28 days, but the lunation cycle of the moon is 29 days. All right, so we get the whole idea here that the moon is giving back and it's spent and it needs rejuvenation, and that rejuvenation comes at the new moon, and then it starts all over again. But by then, that 29 days means it's in another sign. So what starts at the next new moon has a totally different quality according to the sign that the sun is in. Now, once a year, there are 2 new moons in the same sign of the zodiac, and those are very special times because they sort of redouble the influence of that sign in the development of something. And this is something that is very, very well known. At the university here, they have in the Oriental Studies Department, they have Chinese calendars going through the different dynasties in China, and the Ming calendar is the most astrological solely lunar calendar that I've ever seen. There is only one lunar calendar that I know of, only one. I think only the Muslims use a completely lunar calendar, which says something about the nature of that belief system. It's totally lunar, but otherwise it's solely lunar, meaning sun and moon calendar. And in a solely lunar calendar, there are 13 new moons in a year, but only one of those 13 is in the same sign as the new moon preceding it. And that is called an intercalary month. And that intercalary month, where it is placed in the calendar, it varied in various periods of history. Now in solely lunar calendars, as are used in China and other parts of the Orient, the intercalary month is always in the same place. So that what we call the Tet new moon or the Chinese new moon always happens at the same time. Always happens with the same intercalary month. But the intercalary month used to be put in at various times of the year, and only in the Ming calendar was the intercalary month put in the sign where there were 2 new moons in one sign. All right, so we're saying here that the moon is only visible from midnight until dawn in the 4th quarter, and the last sextile is a synthetic sextile, and that synthetic sextile is from experience. You can put it all together, the whole variety of experience from the entire cycle. Okay. That's just about all that we're going to do tonight. It's going to be under an hour, but to do more would not be wise. So what we're saying is that this is the cycle of cycles. All cycles follow the same pattern. What we're going to do is we're going to look at this is called a binary cycle. A binary cycle is where you have 2 members contributing to the cycle. A unary cycle is where you have only one, and that is like from the time that the sun enters Leo, which is its rulership, until it comes back again. The annual cycle is a unary cycle. I don't know of anybody that uses trinary cycles or a higher level cycles, but basically it's binary and unary cycles, and the most basic 2-force cycle is the solely lunar cycle, and we're going to use that as the basis for studying all cycles eventually. Right now what we're going to do is we're going to see how new moons or lunation cycles fill into the period of a transit, which fills into a progression, and this is narrowing things down in time, so that if there is a manifestation of an aspect that is at a given time, that during a progression and a transit, the phase of the moon when that occurs is important, especially if the phase of the moon is a new moon. That is the beginning of something, and the new moon is sort of, it's the germ out of which the entire lunation cycle, the building and the deconstruction of it takes place. So that's important. So we're going to try and bring this into understanding periods within progressions. Now, sometimes we don't have enough time to do it tonight because we're almost at 60 minutes already. Sometimes a new moon or a full moon is an eclipse, and that brings accentuation. And the effect of a new moon will be for a month. But the effect of an eclipse, especially an eclipse of the sun, can be for half a year or sometimes even an entire year. So when there's an eclipse of the moon, that is a special revelation, that is a special feedback, that is a special mirroring effect to be able to reflect and understand something. So we're going to talk a little bit about eclipses and eclipse cycles somewhere along the way. But now you have the idea of what we've been trying to do with the whole series of talks. We began with vague, indirect astrological influences on different stages of life or different sectors of life. And then we began looking at things in horoscopes for periods of several years down to now a month. And that's about as far as we're going to go. We're going to start looking at focuses. And when we have done that, we won't try to do any predicting, but we will try to give some good examples of these kinds of things. I've had several of them very strikingly good examples in my own life. That's one of those things when you use astrology, you look at your own life, and that's where you learn something. All right, that's as far as we'll go tonight. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been helpful to you, and please recognize that even though we breezed through this swiftly, we'll come back to some aspects of it again and again, because this is very fundamental. Everything spiritually and astrologically happens in cycles. People try to look at different events, but events sometimes don't have any meaning unless they can be understood in the context of a larger cycle. And to understand any cycle, you want to understand the most basic, the most fundamental cycle of all, which is the lunation cycle. So, thank you very much.